Welcome everybody back to At the Forefront. I'm delighted today to be joined by my guest, Abel Pearson. He is the founder of Glasbren, which is a Welsh-based, West Wales, in fact, based social enterprise that uses permaculture practices to show that smaller scale sustainable farms led by local communities can address both local and global challenges to food security and our climate. Not a small undertaking. Glasbren offers volunteering opportunities, courses, workshops, and more to teach nature skills and foster an appreciation of the environment in their community. They are doing really incredible things and have an amazing buy-in from all of the local people that they're working with. And in fact, they are driven very by their community. They are harnessing the power of food growing to create transformative social and ecological change and supporting local households through their community-supported agriculture scheme, which includes offering veg boxes on a sliding payment scale and teaching members of the community to cook affordable and nutritious meals. Abel's vision is something that's really quite astounding, and I'm really excited to give you all a chance to hear more about, because we're joining them when they are 1 year on from securing their new home. So they've just taken on a lease of a 134-acre farm in West Wales from the National Trust, which they took on in 2024. And they have already created a community hub for learning, healing and collaboration, and a place where regenerative farming, community care and ecological restoration can come together. So I know you'll have lots of questions. Please do. I've got questions, but please do feel free to jump in if you want to hear more about certain aspects while we're having a conversation, but also there'll be lots of time at the end. This has been an extremely popular, possibly one of our most popular so far, I think, at the forefront. So we know we've got a lot of interested people. But Abel, let's start with the basics. So can you, I mean, I've given a broad brush overview, but do you want to talk a little bit more about what Glasbren do and what inspired you to set Glasbren up in the first place?
Thank you, Mary Rose. Thank you, everyone. It's lovely to be here. I'm calling in from, as Mary Rose said, from West Wales, from a place called Llansteffan. And the farm here is on the cliffs where three rivers meet, the Taf, the Towy and the Gwendraeth, meet the sea in this quite incredible, unique estuary sort of landscape. It's where Glasbren is hosted. So Glasbren is a Welsh language word for sapling, a young tree, which is a symbol that we chose to sort of represent the roots of regeneration, the sort of potential and power in a young tree for its regenerative power, but also sort of the symbology of a woodland as a community, as a reciprocal ecosystem, and being a young project with initially shallow roots going deeper and deeper into place and community. So that's where our sort of name and our symbol comes from. And we are a community, essentially a community facing, community agriculture project, harnessing the role that we think small farms, small community-facing farms and community-supported agriculture can play in addressing some of the bigger issues of our time, social, ecological, cultural, bringing people together in community in sort of meaningful and in ways, I suppose, people used to come together around the seasons. Apologies for that. Also bringing people into relationship with nature, with the seasons, with their local lands, and offering a sense of belonging and relationship with the more than human, and trying to address issues around food security and challenges around having a sustainable and regenerative food system. And Glasbren kind of arose out of my background, I suppose, is in permaculture. So permaculture being a sort of whole systems design framework for how we can meet these three ethics: earth care, people care, fair share, in any facet of our lives, whether you want to apply it on a balcony in a city or to a community or to an organization. So at every level, Glasbren kind of integrates the principles and ethics of permaculture, from how we organize as directors to how we grow food on the ground. And that was my kind of background. That was training in that and kind of immersing myself in the world of permaculture, the way different people were doing it around the world, kind of brought me to land work and brought me to ecologically responsible land work. But I think really spending time at a community called Ecodharma in the north of Spain, it was essentially a center for regenerative activism. So it was a place where people would come to learn skills for long-term resilience as activists, whatever their sort of field of activism might have been. And that was a land-based community, and so I was surrounded by people with quite bright heart fires and quite passionate commitment to service and to outward facing work. And I think that sort of transformed for me a sense of like land work not just being about meeting my own needs or the people immediately around me in a sustainable way, but how could it be something that was in service to the community and a wider circle of people, whilst also being in service to the land, to nature, to the soil. So yeah, I suppose that's in a nutshell how Glasbren was born, and then I felt called back to the place I grew up in West Wales, and the incredible potential and green moist land that we have here, and started Glasbren, became a community interest company in 2019.
Do you want because I'm sure there may not be, but for in case there is, and for people who might be watching afterwards, who are really very much amateurs in this world, could you just very quickly explain what permaculture is and means for
Absolutely.
those of us that are not experts in this, like myself?
Mm. Yeah, I think it's good to talk about that because I feel like there's a lot of misinterpretation of permaculture, or it can be limited in the way folks see it and use it, and some of its potential can be lost. So for me, this is the definition that I would sort of propose in any workshop or course, is that permaculture is a whole systems approach. So looking at everything as a whole, like an ecosystem. Nothing is isolated. Nothing works in isolation. A whole systems approach to the design. So it's a design framework primarily. The word permaculture derives from permanent and agriculture. So it's two Australian fellas called Bill Mollison and David Holmgren. In the 1970s, they wanted to devise a sustainable form of agriculture. They came up with this framework. They called it permaculture, based on permanent and agriculture. So it was this idea of creating a permanence in our food systems where it could go on forever, essentially, without depleting, without diminishing the soil. But yeah, it's really obviously it was initially intended for agriculture. In the years since, it's been developed out to encompass many different approaches to design. So it's used in social permaculture uses the principles of permaculture in how we design organizations, how we organize as human beings, all towards the same goal, which is regeneration, resilience, sustainability. So in any context, any part of our lives, we can apply these design principles to how can we be resilient, how can we be well, how can we be regenerative, whatever the system might be, whether it's your own body or whether it's a big organization, you can apply those same principles to the design approach. And so it's not, permaculture isn't about gardening, if you get my drift. Like it's applied most commonly probably in gardening, in terms of the principles, everything from no dig gardening to composting to agroforestry, using trees, orchards. So it's very well applied in gardening and most commonly applied in gardening, but it's really limited, I think, to think of it purely in terms of gardening, because its potential is vast. And it's really about bringing everything back to this ethical sort of like checklist, like holding yourself and your organization and your project or to an ethical framework, essentially. So you could frame it with these three ethics of earth care, people care, fair share. So always testing your decision making against those things.
So is it in very, very summarized form about basically putting back more than you take out?
Yeah, I think so. But maybe beyond that, even maybe
Yeah.
beyond, maybe being, because even permanent feels a little limited in the sense of like we don't want to stay where we are. We want to, there's the analogy that I hear a lot of, like, with the word sustainability. Is that a word we want to, stop at? Because that, my teacher used to say, if someone asked how your marriage or your relationship was, would you want to say sustainable? You want to say it's regenerative, it's growing, it's constantly
Yeah,
evolving,
yeah.
adapting. And that's, I suppose, the systems that we're trying to design. So yeah, that's kind of a sense of what permaculture is to me.
Thank you. That's really helpful for me, and hopefully will be for other people. But in terms of climate change and food security, how do you feel what you're doing at Glasbren and also permaculture more generally is really related to those issues?
Yeah, I suppose I would probably answer that in two threads. One being the very practical, which is, I did a webinar recently on flood and drought mitigation in regenerative farms. So how we can look at the very real changes that we will be facing in terms of climate change, as farmers, growers, producers, and so thinking about increasing changes in weather patterns becoming less predictable. We're not getting the same sort of seasonal patterns that growers and farmers of yore would have been able to rely on. So last year we had a washout spring. This year we had a very, very dry spring. And so what can we do to sort of practically mitigate those things? And for us, that comes down to rainwater catchment, lots of water storage, harnessing that rainwater we have in the winter for the drier months, making sure we're building the water holding capacity of the soil. And so that is developing really healthy soil with lots of organic matter that can, like a sponge, store water, integrating trees into our systems. Trees are amazing for helping the land to store water. Um, so and then flood mitigation on the other end. We live in an area where there's been very, very bad flooding recently, in recent years, mostly related to, well, obviously changing rainfall patterns, but also poor land management and irresponsible farming practices. So I suppose that brings me to the second strand of this for me, which is about demonstration and about demonstrating climate adapted farming approaches, um, never having bare soil, always making sure the soil has got living plants in it, a lot of working with green manures. Um, but also, I suppose, what's the incredible potential of community facing farming and community supported agriculture is that what we meet in our volunteers and people who come to events is this sense of despair and um, inertia, if you like, of like, what can I do? What can I do about the climate situation? What can I do about climate change? And I think that's the other end of this, is offering a sense of empowerment to people to take positive, practical action in a simple local way, to feel like they're engaged in some practical climate action, which I believe community farming is. It's helping us together as a group, as a community, develop our resilience against climate change, and a secure climate adapted source of food. Um, and just, yeah, being in contact with, for me personally, I believe that the kind of change that we need to see is a sort of on the level of sort of attitude, consciousness. Like we need to come back into relationship with the earth and with the non-human. And I think from that place, we can't fail to sort of act responsibly, because if it would be like hurting something that we love or hurting someone that we love, or and so that's the other dimension of why I think this is important.
Yeah, this I think leads on quite nicely from what you've just been saying there, is that because this is very much related to the challenges that are facing the UK's farming industry at the moment. I wonder if you want to just say a little bit more about how, the uncertainty around farm support and payment systems and subsidies changing
Mm,
plays into. I mean, it's sort of the challenges bring opportunities to really do exactly what you're saying there, and in getting us more in connected to the natural world.
mm. Yeah, well, I mean, I can speak mostly from a Welsh context, in terms of the Wales support schemes and things, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a shame to see the sort of level of backlash that there was when the sort of sustainable farming scheme, that the required actions that were laid out for our new sustainable post-Brexit sort of farm support scheme, which they call the sustainable farming scheme. There was a lot of backlash against the sort of environmental actions that were going to be required, and I think that that speaks to sort of partly the way that the way that it's applied. It's applied as a top-down sort of you have to do this sort of an obligation, and that's almost like the complete wrong way round. I think, yeah, I think there was a time not too long ago, and there are many who still exist, when farming was probably the most connected way to be in relationship with land, in relationship with the seasons, with subtle changes. I've spent time with the tenant who was here before, and he has an incredible awareness of this landscape, an incredible 51-year connection, to the point where he would listen for sounds that come from the estuary and the sea to dictate when he would cut the hay and these kind of things. Um, so it's just something that's been lost, I suppose. And so I can understand the backlash, and I can understand the reaction, because farmers are already under a lot. A lot of the focus was on the environmental schemes, but I think ultimately it's sort of a last straw type situation, where farmers have been under the yoke of supermarkets and the prices that supermarkets drive and the pressures that come with that. And I think um, for a lot of farmers, this, losing their subsidies, or having to completely um, U-turn on their approaches to meet the new subsidy system, is just a sort of a last straw of many pressures that they've been under. Um, yeah, so I think, and speaking of supermarkets, I think that's the exciting potential I see in the sort of community supported model, is that for us, that we don't need to rely on the supermarket system whatsoever. We have members, we have people who pledge their support for the whole season. Um, we know at the beginning of the year that everything we grow is already sold, which gives us huge financial resilience as a project. Um, People getting engaged with the growing of the food, they come and get involved, they volunteer, so that shifts the way that they value the food, the way that they see the food and the people that grow it. So consumers are in relationship with producers. Um, and so that takes all of that uncertainty of, supermarkets dictating prices and prices being changed, um, and supply and demand changing at a whim. It completely takes that out of the system, and that for me is resilience. It gives us the security to know that what we produce has somewhere to go, and every penny of the value of that food goes back to the farm.
We've had a great question from Bruce Howard. Thank you, Bruce, who loved your explanation of permaculture. But what do the farming unions in Wales, he's asking, make of what you're doing? And how do you talk about it with them in
Mm.
days when food security is such a big thing?
Thank you, Bruce. That's a big question. I'm not so sure about the NFU, and think, I can only speak from, so I quite recently stopped working for the Land Workers Alliance, who are a union in the UK, of a community union of small scale agroecological farmers and food producers. And we are Glasbren. We are a very active and keen member of the Land Workers Alliance too. And so that's probably where a lot of my awareness of what changes are happening on a government level, or any lobbying that's being done, are happening. I mean, there's a lot so we've been doing this about 6 years. There's been a huge seismic shift in engagement from the bigger bodies in agriculture, and Welsh government, particularly in terms of engagement with things that felt very fringe and niche 6 years ago, that are now very central. Like words like food security. We weren't talking about food security 5, 6 years ago. And I guess COVID and Brexit have kind of brought into sharp focus the fragility of our food system, and the supermarkets that we depend on. So yeah, it's sort of hard for me to say what they're doing, but all I can say is that there's a lot more happening now, and there's a lot more engagement in this kind of stuff. I think there's still probably a way to go with community supported agriculture and seeing the value of that as a model. There's still, I feel like there's two strands of versions of the future, and one is how do we make the existing system more sustainable, and that's probably what the farming unions are. That's probably the approach they're taking. And then there's the other stream, which is like how do we completely change the way that food is shared and distributed? And I suppose we're more on that stream of like, no, we just need completely different models and systems rather than just trying to make the existing systems a little bit better.
With Before I go back to, we're having some really interesting other questions in the chat, but before I go to them, I feel like it might be an appropriate time to ask you. So, as I understand it, your farm that you moved onto, the 134 acres last year, is National Trust land.
Mhm.
And I know there's obviously a huge potential for the National Trust to replicate this model. What's happening with that? Where do you see that as being something that the National Trust are really behind and might want to do lots more of? And are they really excited about how they're working with you and wanting to kind of disseminate this across more of their, I can't remember how many tens of thousands of acres that they have in the UK, but it's more of their tens of thousands of acres.
Yeah, so maybe I should backtrack and share a bit of the story about how this all happened.
Please do.
So we started on 4 acres or 3 acres, I think it was, of sort of permanent market garden where we started with the veg boxes and volunteering and courses and things, and then we were kind of had our eyes out for an expansion opportunity, and in 2021, I think it was, one of our veg box members invited me to a public meeting the National Trust were holding about this farm that had been empty for 3 years. And the previous tenants who'd been there 51 years had retired, and they sort of laid out their new vision for all of their farms and holdings and estates, which is essentially nature, people, planet is their new approach. So those three prongs, and so you can imagine, probably from what you've heard of Glasbren so far, is that really piqued my interest, and I was pretty excited about this as a possible place for Glasbren in the future. And so it took another 2 years until the application process, but the advert came out and it went completely viral around the world. So much so that the National Trust had applications from Australia, the US, Afghanistan, many different places. There were 37 applications, I believe. And we heard in, I think, July 2023 that we'd been selected, and I suppose they could see in what we proposed, that we were committed to nature-friendly farming, to working in relationship with the land, to increase biodiversity, capture carbon, this kind of things, meeting that sort of nature part of the three-pronged targets, but equally the people-focused nature of the project. So how we propose to involve and integrate the community in the farm, because the farm is very close to a local village. It's got a very strong place in a lot of people's hearts, a very alive heritage and history that people are very aware of, have family connections to. The Wales Coast Path comes right through the farm, and so many people walk their dogs through here, and so it's got, it was important that they made the right decision, I think, about who it was, and that they and for the community, I think it was important that it was a local project and something that was going to only increase people's access to the farm rather than decrease it. So, I think, the National Trust are hugely behind us. They've been only positive really about our vision. They use the word flagship or beacon sometimes, and I think they really want this to be an example of how they maybe approach their farms in the future, because I don't think they've often had social enterprises coming into farms. I think this might be one of the first National Trust farms to sort of operate as a social enterprise. And I know now in Pembrokeshire, there's some farms that they're looking to sort of implementing a similar kind of thing. And so that for us is as well as the impact we might have locally, is a massive opportunity to somehow influence or help demonstrate how National Trust farms, which invariably have pretty good building infrastructure, often have good access and good sort of public perception around them. So they're really ripe for this kind of project, I think. And I suppose, yeah, long-term goal is to really demonstrate something that could be replicated. Because yeah, they do own, I think, something like 1 million acres in the UK.
Yeah,
So, um,
in thousands. Yeah.
yeah, think about the access potential. If you think about yeah, the potential of rolling out this kind of approach to farming is massive.
And certainly from our perspective at the forum, one of the reasons why we're so excited to be working with you and backing you is because there is so much replication potential. That's what one of the things that I think is so exciting about it.
Mm.
But let's go to some of the questions that people are asking. So, relating back to your relationship with the community, and I don't know whether you want to say a little bit more as well about, it wasn't totally plain sailing. I know you've explained to me about how actually there was a certain at the beginning there was a certain sort of questioning within the community of like, was this actually what people wanted, and how you got around that. But then we've had a few questions about how do your customers have an influence, or do they have an influence on what you're growing, and are you operating allotment areas on the farm for the community, which relates back to that, but please do tell us more.
Okay, so yeah, so in terms of the community buy-in, I suppose that first meeting that I mentioned earlier, um, for me was amazing because I was slightly objective, so I could sort of see the potential in the National Trust vision. It was quite charged, I would say. There was a lot of strong feeling in the room, um, mostly because of, I suppose, change. Like it represent whatever happened, whoever was chosen, there was going to be change, and it represented change. And I think um, we do represent change in quite a strong way. But I think also what's helped with that is that we want to make changes and we're looking to the future, but we're also trying to honor the past and trying to honor the heritage of this farm. And a big part of the project is sort of enlivening, rehydrating sort of heritage traditions, cultural traditions related to agriculture and the seasons. So we have, for example, next weekend we've got a celebration for Calan Mai, which is the Welsh May Day, and we'll have maypole dancing, and we'll have activities related to the hawthorn blossom, and so trying to and this is all informed by historical knowledge of Welsh traditions related to Calan Mai and how people once were gathered, and I think those kind of things, they're not too far from people's memory, so that's a quite powerful way to sort of, I suppose, develop engagement and acceptance because of how we try to value the Welsh language and Welsh traditions, and that this farm has a history and a story already. It's not coming in with all the ideas and thinking we know everything and just sort of supplanting something into the farm with no acknowledgement of what's already here. And I suppose that's quite a permacultural thing too, really, to go back to, of taking time first when you first arrive anywhere is to observe what's already here, who already lives here, what are the stories that are, and spirits that are already here, kind of, and so that's felt really important, to be very vocal and visible about how we're trying to respect that. And then, I think generally speaking, we ran a big crowdfunder last July, and the engagement with that was incredible, and such a powerful mandate for what we wanted to do, and sort of a seal of approval. I think we raised just under 50,000 from that, and yeah, just the way people got behind that was sort of like, because we came into this with a lot of faith, a lot of, it's a quite a big risk really looking back, because we didn't really have any capital. We didn't have, we'd been operating as a social enterprise for a while, but we didn't have big amounts of reserves or so we sort of came into it with the faith that we'd be able to raise the money, but also the faith that the community would gather behind it, and they have, and we have, and thanks to to the Four as well, people, organizations like the Four, and yeah, it's happening, and it just sort of solidifies and confirms that there's an appetite and a hunger for this kind of thing, and it's the time, it's the time we're living in, a time when this is what people need.
We've had a couple of questions actually on this, Abel. How much does your model rely on grants and social investment?
Mm.
And also, how resilient are you to, changes in yields and if your customers have pre-bought
Mm.
certain things, if you then can't provide them because of,
Mm.
changes in the weather or whatever means you have different crop yields.
Yeah,
How does that work?
that's a good question. I'll answer the second one first. So this is one of the beauties of the community supported agriculture model. So if anybody's not familiar, community supported agriculture, or CSA, is a model that kind of draws on. It's not been running too long in the UK, or at least it sort of had a revival in the 90s. But it's sort of inspired by many different areas. There's models in Japan called the Tokai system, which is essentially farm food with the farmer's face on it, and other kind of crop sharing models that developed in the American South, when black farmers were trying to get a fair price and a fair distribution for their produce, creating these sort of clubs essentially where people came together to share in the harvest and guarantee farmers a market for what they were producing. And so CSA is really inspired by those. And as a model, it's quite different, quite radically different from a sort of commodity-based food model where we produce something and we sell it, individual items, bags of spinach or whatever it might be, to individual consumers. It's a membership-based scheme, so people pledge to have whatever's coming out of the ground each week. And most commonly they're expressed as vegetable CSAs, but there are also meat CSAs and there are ferment CSAs or bread CSAs. I think it's a really lovely model for any business actually, to sort of invest people in the business and have people value something as a function of community and as an important service, and so pledge their sort of financial and emotional support to it. And so our members get whatever's coming out the ground every week, and part of that is growing a big diversity of crops. So that's another beauty of it in terms of resilience, is that because we've got such a diversity of crops, if we do have challenges with any one particular crop, we've got 30, 40 others going on at the same time. And that's something that, should be applied to farming in general, really. And diversification in general is just, I think it's behind me, right? Diversity is resilience. And it's true, if we lose a crop, that's not the end because we've got lots of others behind it. So that's and it's more forgiving and realistic because, the real reality of growing in a Welsh climate is that, things are hard and every season's different, and you have pests and you have water challenges, um and so yeah, to have a membership who are forgiving to that and who understand that, who are willing to ride the waves of abundance and scarcity, and willing to eat lots of cabbages and potatoes in the Hungry Gap, knowing that they'll get an abundance of summer crops later in the year. Again, just really supports us as growers, and is more in line with just the reality of farming. Yeah. And I forget the first question was about.
First bit was a bit about how much are you reliant on grants
Oh,
and
yes, of course. So reliance. I mean, right now we feel quite reliant in the sense that we're in this new chapter, having moved to a new site, and it's all setting up and it's all trying to get it quite a big ship moving. So right now, a lot of it is dependent on grants, loans, external finance. But once our revenue streams are re-established, so our first big CSA season is coming up now in June, then that's a really strong revenue stream. That's a big part of our revenue stream. We also have additional revenue streams like courses and workshops, community events. We have a farm supporter program, which is, if you're familiar with Patreon, that's inspired by Patreon, essentially, whereby folks can pledge, because we've heard a lot over the years that people don't necessarily want to get a veg box membership, but they would like to support the work that's going on. And so we've offered the opportunity for people to pay a fiver a month, have a tree named after them in the community orchard, have a few other benefits like different communication benefits and stuff. And that's one of our approaches, I suppose, to weaning off revenue funding. We'll always look at capital funding. We'll always need to go for capital grants, but we would like to become an organization that is not dependent on revenue grants for our social enterprise activities. So we'd like to be able to build to the point where we're funding our own community impact. Um, yeah. So and really feeling like we're grassroots, growing from the support of the community that we serve. That's our goal and ambition, and we're working towards that.
Um, Thank you. I'm just looking back, we've got lots more questions. Heather Johnson has asked, how can we encourage our whole society to value food and understand the true cost of food when supermarkets work on the principle of customers always choosing the cheapest option? Do you think we need to legislate to force corporations to take responsibility and to level the playing field for organisations like Glasbren and Riverford?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, to that question. Yeah, there is a lot of responsibility that falls on governments and legislation, for sure, because I think it's very difficult to change that what's the word, leviathan of a system. But I would say in terms of people valuing food, yeah, I'd come back to that thing of being involved with their food and being involved with how it's grown and facing the farmers that grow it on a regular basis. And yeah, just transforming when you just need to get away from seeing food as a commodity, something that is on a shelf that we pick up. Um, but we've done a lot of work over the years around food security and around how do we make this food more accessible to people on lower incomes or people not typically represented in the membership of veg box schemes, or who attend farm shops, or which we all know is typically quite middle class. And what are the barriers to access? And I think obviously money is a big one, but I think we've noticed also that cooking skills and food literacy, time, just pure mental capacity. Everyone's so stressed and stretched, and just trying to get by. That the idea of sort of being presented with, in some cases, being presented with a box of seasonal veg, even if it was free, was quite overwhelming for people at times. And I just think there's so many different areas in which change has to happen. It's not just about making this food cheaper or redefining the supermarket system. It's about understanding the barriers to people eating this food. And so there are economic realities that we need to change. There are social issues. I think there's a lot, but I think that it starts with people getting their hands in the soil
Mm.
and understanding what it takes to bring food to harvest, and just shifting things completely, whereby you're not actually thinking about the financial price of food. You're thinking of it as a benefit of being a member of a farm in relationship with a farm, and maybe as a benefit of something that's restorative and healthy in other ways, like volunteering is, just being out on the land in contact with the soil is so healthy and good for us that it could be seen as just a healthy, extra benefit of that.
I know Tess Humble, who is involved with one of the only CSAs in Scotland in the Tyningham Community Farm. She's asking about, with the CSAs, your CSA scheme, do you have making food cost accessible for those who need it written into your model? Because I know you do have a sliding scale on your food boxes, but also Maddie Longhurst is asking about your relationship with community kitchens in nearby towns. And that's something that I think I'm really interested in is, it's wonderful if you're living near to Glasbren that you can have access to the CSA. But if you're somebody who's living in a town that it's much harder to be connected, how can we get the benefits and support organisations and people like you who are doing permaculture farming when
Mm.
we're in cities?
Yeah, so in terms of supporting if you're not nearby, I suppose that's why part of the reason we want to do sort of immersive uh, residential experiences here. That's one of the big potentials of this place, is that we can accommodate people on residential experiences. And so that's something we'd like to do for folks, much further afield. Um, In terms of people who might have geographical or transport barriers to coming here, we have the Real Farming Trusts have supported us to buy a vehicle that allows us to transport people here to volunteer if they want to. We also deliver our veg boxes to front doors as well as hubs. So that's sort of, we do that within a 10-mile radius of the farm. Um, and I'm losing the question now.
I think the last part was, do you work with community
Yes,
kitchens
yeah.
in?
Yeah, so we have a really great community kitchen in Carmarthen, which is our nearest big town. It's got about 20,000 people, called Keg and Hedin, which means seed kitchen, essentially. And I do feel like that's the ideal model of sort of the ideal solidarity food model. Having done lots of experiments and we worked with research institutions to see how a sort of solidarity veg box model could work. It feels like food that's um, processing the food or cooking the food and making it available is probably one of the real answers, as well as, people coming to volunteer and getting a free veg box. I think preparing the food into meals at community kitchens, or like Keg and Hedden do, preparing essentially ready meals in a community freezer that contain organic local produce, is a really great way of addressing those things that I mentioned around capacity, time, stress, like making it as easy as possible for folks to eat this kind of food, I think is really great. And yeah, we do have a relationship with Keg and Hedden, and hopefully we'll supply them more and more going forward with both. They're great. They'll buy produce, but they also take surplus produce too. So yeah, that's something that we really, and partnerships in general for us are really important. We have relationship with our local community environment centre, and we run events with them in the urban environment to sort of close that gap between rural and urban. And yeah, so it's relationships and partnerships are really key to our success, I think.
We are at 1:45 already. We're supposed to be finishing, but there's still lots of questions. I'm going to just finish with one last one, and then we will circulate. We've had lots of lovely messages in the chat, Glasbren, congratulating you on all of the, sorry, Abel, congratulating Glasbren on all of the amazing thing that you're doing at Glasbren. But just finishes off with, what are your biggest challenges at the moment? Because I mean, you're doing so much and you're making such a fantastic impact, but as we all know, these things are never look quite as, they're never as simple as they may look when you're talking about it now. And so share with us, is there anything that people on this call might be able to do to help? Is a call to action that you'd like to offer?
Well, I think, I mean, yeah, there's financial challenges are always there, and looking to how we make this financially sustainable. And I think that's what's really striking about the FOR support and the FOR funding is that even the way it was framed, when we applied, was like, what do you need to unlock your potential? And we loved that framing of a funding bid, because that's what it is about. It's about identifying those things that are blocking us, because we know there's a massive potential and we know there's things we can do, but there are just blocks to that that exist systemically, financially. And so, yeah, it's trying to find ways through those blocks. One of those blocks being planning, the planning system. And I know from a lot of my fellow Land Workers Alliance members and work we were doing in the Land Workers Alliance, that planning is one of the biggest barriers to transforming our food system, because it's just not fit for purpose for this kind of approach to food producing. But yeah, what I loved about the FOR is that approach to unlocking potential, and also the willingness to support capacity building within our team, because I think that is always one of our barriers, is the limits of the humans involved. And I have limits, and I'm always trying to push beyond them, but I do have limits, and we have amazing board of directors, but they all have, full-time jobs and their own lives, and an amazing team, but it always feels like we need more human capacity to really fulfill this. So it was really great to be able to fund a fundraising and outreach coordinator through the FOR role, and that's going to help build our capacity in terms of fundraising. But I think back to, we mentioned subsidies and farm support systems. I think what I would love to see is this kind of thing acknowledged as a vital public service, and funded as such centrally, and us not having to go to a sort of patchwork of different charities, social enterprise funders, but for this to be seen as something so important, in terms of not just the food, but the mental health benefits of volunteering, the importance of people coming together around something of meaning, congregating around supporting land and regenerating land. I think, yeah, that would be my call to action, would be for this to be valued as a public service that we can't do without.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to end. We will circulate the chat to make sure that Abel has all of the messages that you are all putting in there, and he can contact you afterwards. But we also, Abel, I don't know if you're happy for people, are you on LinkedIn for people to put your email address into the chat so people can contact you direct? But there are a lot of people who want to come and visit. And there's a huge amount, I think, of groundswell of support and love for what you're doing.
Oh, that's lovely.
Thank you so much indeed for taking the time to share with all of us. And we are, I think, all feeling really inspired and excited. And as with always, sort of our message at the fore is that, we have massive challenges in the UK, but there is always someone out there who has got the answer. And Abel, you couldn't really epitomise that better. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you everyone for your time and for listening and for putting such great questions into the chat, and have lovely weekends, everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thanks for being here, everyone, and your questions and comments.